we are going to share with you are my own thoughts here. And I don't know if you have questions during the presentation, feel free to interrupt me, and also if you have problems to understand my English, feel free to interrupt me anytime. So I decided to have, I don't know how much information you have on this the subject. So I try to put a kind of overview of how financial institutions and finance markets can relate with environmental social issues. Okay, so in order to start, just a little introduction about the historic of these initiatives. I think all the concept of sustainable development starting deeply throughout the 70s with the creation of United Nations Environmental Program, and also later on with the Brundtland Report, gave an overview that money and financial research should be together with sustainability. So we have this initiative throughout the 70s, and later on the 80s and 90s, the big financial institutions, mainly the multilateral ones like the World Bank and the IFC, they were pushed to put forward safeguards to finance basically infrastructures in the developing world. So they have to be concerned about not damaging that that surrounding location and environment and communities, and they settled rules, strict rules regarding risk assessment on environment and social perspectives on the projects. And also we had in the beginnings of 2000s the Equator Principles, also for, it's a kind of auto-regulator initiative. And they also managed to put forward guidelines and requirements to the financial institutions assess the environmental social risk assessment on the projects. All of these initiatives, they are more related to a view on risks or a risk assessment from the financial institutions' perspective. We can discuss now that we have in the last decades from 2000s on, like a shift on this view about the financial institutions, that they should, of course, have a concern, definitely concern about risk assessment, but they also may, or they should, I would say, be engaging in promoting green financing, in promoting and financing environmental friendly initiatives. So it's a kind of balancing between having the safeguards, but also having the products, having financial resources available to develop the environmental social surroundings and locations they finance. Okay. So then we have the credit lines, incentives that we can talk a little bit later on, and the climate initiatives. These all together are more collaborate and inducer view from the financial institutions perspective. And also I forgot to put a word here that also is missing the word opportunities, because they, of course, they are banks and they should see opportunities from all this new green financial environment. Okay. Just to give you some examples on the risk assessment rules. Of course, I'm talking about Brazil. I'm a specialist in the legal framework in Brazil. So we have a very strict rule since the 80s. That's the National Environmental Policy Law, that it deals all the supporters of some project, of a certain project, as a potential polluter. So this integrates the financial institutions as a potential harmer or potentially damaging a location or a surrounding system they are financing. So not only the entrepreneur might be guilty or blamed by damaging an ecosystem, but also it's possible to have a financing or supporter or sponsorship, also guilty in having to identify something or a damage or something that it was caused by the construction of a project. And the official credit financial institutions such as BNDES, for example, BNDES is the Brazilian Development Bank. It's a governmental bank. It is framed in this called official credit in Brazil. They have even more strict rules because it's in since the 80s, the official credit institutions should require all the compliance, the environmental compliance of the projects they support. So that's the case for BNDES, for example. And the rural credit in Brazil as well, it's the regulator authority is the central bank for the rural credit. And you know, as a vast, rich commodity nation that we are here in Brazil, it's very important to have regulation on the rural credit for supporting agriculture. And since the 2008, the central bank in Brazil has been launching rules about environment and social requirements for the financial institutions to support rural credit. And that's a very important measure. And we have also some sort of sectoral rules, including from the central bank, not only for rural credit, but also for sugarcane expansion. And also some banks have sectoral rules as well by their own. For example, BNDES has a rule on meat packers, for example, so they can trace or they can require from the meat packers some sort of compliance and certification on the supply chain to avoid deforestation. And we have also sugarcane rules, mining and export for exportation as well. So they are always examples of how the financial institutions can set rules and specific regulation on some subjects, and also as an overall framework of their policies, their environmental policies, okay? So finally, we have a very innovative rule in Brazil in 2014 that was, it was launched by the central bank as resolution 4327 in 2014. And it's a very innovative approach because the central bank firstly was releasing some sectoral rules on rural credit and so forth, but actually through this regulation, it fulfills like the whole system, because through 4327, all financial institutions in Brazil must have a corporate social and environment responsibility policy. And the great thing about it is not that it should be just like guidelines or principles. No, it should be associate to the guidelines an action plan, and how the financial institution will be showing through reports and auditing their developing and the improvement of the environmental network. Okay, so it has to look not only for principles, but also have to assess each product, each portfolio that the financial institution has, and provide for the society if they have risks, if they are in accordance with the environmental laws compliance. And so it established a baseline for all the financial system in Brazil. And it has also to monitor this action plan. The financial institution must have a committee or something, a governance established to monitor it, to the implementation of each line of this action plan. And this is very important. It's a great shift in financial institutions, because basically they were used to deal with financial committees, and now they have to have sustainability committees, and they have to report each evolution of the action plan. And also the report the effectiveness. It has still a kind of risk assessment exposure, since it, sorry, I have a background noise here. I don't know if you can hear me well. Still have, okay? Okay. So it still has a risk concern, but I think they evolved on the concept of risk, because it's, for the first time, it deals with environmental social risk as not only a credit risk, but also operational and reputational risk. So all these combined pack of risks are verified by the central bank, and the institution should assess it deeply. Okay. Also talking about how can the financial system evolve and improve their commitments with the environment. Many of them have exclusion lists, and this means that they will halt to finance some specific project or sector. It's traditional to avoid supporting, for example, guns or open mines, but we can see each time more financial institutions stopping financing fossil fuels. So this is a trend now. BNDES, for example, stopped financing coal power plants in 2017. And we can see that many multilateral international organizations such as IDB, World Bank, they have some kind of goals to phasing out the financing of fossil fuels. And recently, the European Bank just last month announced it is halting, it's phasing out the financing of fossil fuels. So this is a new tendency to align, to have more alignment of the financial products, financial institution projects with the climate commitments of their countries in Paris Agreement. Okay. And also to credit lines. In terms of credit lines, we have many financial institutions. They found out that they have a specific role on diminishing, for example, interest rates, and have specific products for renewables, for restoration, forest restoration, for public transportation, and many other projects that are aiming to reduce the carbon footprint in the world. Okay. Of course, they have to be more innovative in this case. We can talk a little bit further about this, because sometimes to support environmental projects or climate-friendly projects, we have to be more ambitious and not to deal exactly with the concepts, the traditional concepts of credit. We have to take more risks sometimes in terms of guarantees, in terms of be creative in instruments or subordinated loans or first loss guarantees. So it's important to have this in mind, that to support climate-friendly projects, we have to deal with technology to boost this innovative approach. And I think that the green bonds came to show the importance of this, and how they can be, the financial institutions and also the companies that are raising funds through green bonds, they can show that can replicate these initiatives and gain earns on that. So, for example, BNDES was the first Brazilian bank to issue green bonds. We raised $1 billion, and it was a very successful emission. We dropped so far the interest rates, and we used our large renewables portfolio, because BNDES has been financing wind power plants for more than 2 decades. And this was very appealing to the investors. We approached more than about 20% of the investors were those kind of investors that are only willing to finance green bonds or social or green bonds. Okay, so this is amazing. And the market of green bonds, I don't know if João Paulo will talk a little bit more about this, has been increasing since then, since the Paris Agreement in 2015, have a boosting this market. Some other concerns that I would like to mention. UNEP FI is the branch of the United Nations Environmental Program for the financial institutions, and it's very concerned on how to leverage the assessment of and the awareness of the banks throughout the climate issues. So they launched 2 important frameworks explaining how the financial system might be impacted with the physical and also the transition risks of climate change. So, for example, in long-term financing projects, sometimes financing, for example, a port, we look for this amortization schedule for 20 or 30 years. But if you cannot foresee the projections, climate projections in 30 years or 20 years for that specific location, maybe if the project is not aligned, it's not well adapted to face sea level rise, for example, the project might be negatively impacted by climate change, and the banks, the supporters, will not be receiving the resource they financed. So this is a kind of physical risk of the climate change, but they are also concerned about the transition risks. That means through the engagement of the countries in the Paris Agreement with their national development commitments, the NDCs, they determined the commitments, NDCs, they committed to to try to not go beyond 2 degrees Celsius, beyond the pre-industrial level until 2100. So many countries established firm commitments on that, and the banks are also trying to support these commitments, and some regulators as well. So what they are concerned in the future, that many regulators can pose some rules trying to avoid or prevent new coal power plants, for example. And if this is the future, maybe if you are still assessing how to finance coal power plant, maybe in 20 or in 15 or in 10 years, we'll have problems if your portfolio are full of fossil fuels loans. So this is a concern, and UNEP-FI is helping the financial institutions to look at these risks. But they also put some opportunities, of course, in terms of credit lines and new instruments that we have been discussing before. Another initiative is the Carbonization Coalition that was supported by UNEP-FI. And it means that many investors and the capital market is also willing to commit some partnerships, willing to commit their investments not in fossil fuels anymore. So they have a big kind of assets now, committing themselves not to put in practice more not climate-friendly investments, okay? And also there are the principles for responsible banking that UNEP-FI just launched in last September, and trying to, for the banks that engage in the initiative, they will try to receive like commitments in terms not only in guidelines but also in structure and how they can put an agenda of environmental climate into their boards effectively, because this is a very big concern on financial institutions. And the principles for responsible investments, the PRI, is an initiative more for investors. They have many principles that are aligned with ESG, environment, social, and governance initiatives. So all the investments the signatories are looking for, they have to assess the portfolio if they are not harming any community. So they have to have a deep look into the investment they are undertaking. And the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, that's known as TCFD, it's an initiative with recommendations of the Financial Stability Board. The Financial Stability Board is comprised by all the central banks from G20. So the biggest economies in the world and their central banks are committed to this initiative. And they are so concerned with systemic risks on the financial system regarding climate issues that they launched recommendations to everyone, companies and also financial institutions, to look at their balance sheets, to look at the portfolio, and they have to assess how exposure they are to fossil fuels and to other non climate friendly investments. Because in the future, they will try to regulate this, and they are yet piloting some initiatives on that. And recently they received the report about some pilot products, but the report was somehow that there is a gap between what they expected and what they received. Actually, they said that we still are so far from achieving a more disclosure balance of what the companies and financial institutions are supporting. There are also lack of metrics, lack of tools. Taxonomy is a problem because what one specific bank, for example, recall as climate or mitigation project or adaptation project, another one might be classifying differently. So there are many challenges ahead, but the task force initiative is so strong because they are with the central banks. So we think that near future they will try to put in place effective regulations on that, because nowadays the people are not more talking about climate risks, but climate emergency. And so we are now in the middle of a COP25, and unfortunately the news are not so good in terms of diminishing the CO2 emissions. And then we may fail, and if not everyone is willing to be in the game. And of course, financial institutions are a big player on that. And another initiative is the climate action in financial institutions. That's basically led by the French Development Bank, Ph.D, and all the other many big banks are together in this initiative. They have a close approach with each one of the accredited institutions to train, to give awareness on the risks, and also the opportunities to face this new low carbon future that we aim to reach. Finally, I'd like to stress that we are in an unavoidable path. We are very, there is no way out. So everyone is in the same path. We don't have how to regret on that, and not be part on these initiatives of green finance, environmental issues. So everyone, investors, insurers, some insurance companies are also halting, avoiding, have cover for coal power plants, for example. So we are evolving to reach a different framework from we came from, and not in terms of risk assessment, but also as proactive actions. And as we could observe, the role of regulators are incredibly important. And so not only internal regulators, but also these stakeholder collaborative initiatives through United Nations, or through the Financial Stability Board, or through any other initiatives that are arriving. and being creative and the use of technology is should be on the table, because we are now facing a different framework also for the banks. For example, we have fintechs, we have banks by apps. So we have to be creative to engage all these collaborators and all these new technologies and innovative approach through the mainstreaming the climate action and search for a low carbon future. And new mechanisms, as I mentioned before, there are many things to structure. There are different labs constituted throughout the world. So IADB is leading a lab to be innovative, financially innovative in terms of how to finance climate projects, how to adapt, how to engage with public sector for that, how to engage with regulators. So there are many initiatives on that. We could speak for a whole day about this. And definitely we will not eradicate poverty or diminish inequalities, reaching the SDG goals without the commitment of the banks. So this is definitely because of this, many companies and banks are also creating not only more green bonds, but SDG bonds, social bonds, ESG bonds, and many other instruments, and they are trying to be engaged and marking all their portfolio with the numbers of the SDGs, because this is an unavoidable approach. And not only climate is an issue anymore, but of course we have programs, initiatives for decarbonize the economy, but we have also new initiatives on how to certify and check if what we are financing are in compliance with the supply chain, and it's not engaged with deforestation, or how can we boost natural solutions, financing natural solutions to overcome this big issue that's the global warming. Basically, that's the message I would like to share with you. It's very broad, it's not specific, but if you have any doubt, any change, or any opportunity to talk more about this, can share with me, and I put my email as well.
Thank you, Daniela.
My pleasure.
Okay, thank you. That was a very interesting overview. So that gives us a good kind of overview and historical trajectory. And now João Paulo is going to discuss, I think, specifically more about the potential of the Green New Deal. So that will be a nice, more specific case. And so if anybody has questions, please note them in the chat. And then after João Paulo speaks, we'll open it up for questions and discussion.
My main goal today is to bring several of these tools that have been used to tackle climate change on the international level. What some people call that is a global Green New Deal effort, and discuss at what extent it might be applied to the developing countries' reality and also to the Amazon reality. Daniela, at the beginning of her presentation, she brought an overview and a timeline on sustainable development discussion. I want to go a little broader and bring a discussion on development theory and development policy in the world, like since the 50s actually. She gave us an overview since the 70s to show like how the development agents approach changes a long time. Because we know that during the 50s and during the 60s, especially in CLAC and the United Nations, the discussion was to industrialize Latin America and try to
João Paulo, excuse me.
It's still wrong.
Yeah. If you have a different microphone, computer.
I will change the microphone. I'll change the microphone.
And we couldn't listen well this slide, your slide, this one.
Sorry?
Hein, João Paulo? A gente também não pôde ouvir as suas explicações desse slide.
Tudo bem, eu recomeço.
Você deve começar. Na verdade, será que a gente pergunta para algumas pessoas se eles estão ouvindo bem também?
Yeah. Via Zoom, rather than here at the classroom at UF, could you just comment if you're hearing, or just please note in the chat. Marlene or Angelica. Well, Angelica's here, sorry. But Marlene, Paula, Sarah, Laney, Rain, Lee. Let us know if you're hearing it or not.
Yeah, they are not hearing.
Tá funcionando esse, não? Não, né? A headphone.
Yes, I think it is. You have to speak. Okay. Okay, thanks everybody for answering. Yeah, they were as well. But go ahead now, João Paulo. Let's see if we can hear you now. No, right now we don't hear anything.
Let me call him. Because it was working in the beginning. I don't know what's happening.
Yes, we heard you in the beginning well, but now we don't hear you at all, João Paulo.
The microphone is on.
Now we hear you moving the furniture.
Headsets. Okay.
Okay, we can hear you now.
What about now? It's working?
Okay. You can go ahead. And unfortunately, I'll interrupt you again if we can't hear you, but you start. I think we'll be able to hear you.
It was better with the microphone, the interference.
We don't hear it all right now, João Paulo.
João Paulo, it's better to.
E acho que agora foi. Agora foi, não?
Maybe.
Foi agora? Foi?
It works, but it's even worse.
Well, you're not speaking.
Yes.
It's even worse now?
No.
Worse?
No, I will call you in your phone, okay?
Yeah, let's do that. Can I connect using my phone to the yeah, okay, let's do that. Great.
Yeah. And I have his presentation as well.
He emailed me the presentation.
Yes, okay.
But he can leave it Zoom and then just talk.
Oh, he can? Okay. Alô?
Oi, e aí?
Então, aqui a gente está te ouvindo agora pelo telefone.
Tá ótimo. Por mim tá ok. Não sei se os... Tá ótimo. Pelo telefone, né? Ah! Sério? Caramba. É porque eu tô sem fone agora. Tá bom. Vamos fazer assim, então. Tá bom.
Tá, vou desligar. Continua aí, João
Yeah,
Paulo.
I was definitely not expecting that it would work without
Yes.
headsets. Like, it's fine. But I'm not hearing you.
It doesn't matter.
So you need to...
Yeah, we're not saying anything. João Paulo, you can go ahead. We can hear you just fine right now.
Yeah, now I can hear you either.
Okay.
It's fine. Yeah, sorry for that, guys. So as I was saying, like I will bring a discussion on development theory and try to associate that with the financial tools that have been provided to tackle climate change, and at what extent it's applied for the reality of developing countries and Latin America. And the development theory debate, like since during the 50s, were very centered in the idea of industrializing Latin America to reach sustainable growth and increase in the income of Latin American countries. Was defended at Clark by Prebisch. But nowadays, as you already know, this discussion on structure change to a discussion on transformative change, in which the development should consider the sustainable development goals. The Clark is now talking on environmental big push, and it definitely has much to do with the discussion on the industrial structure in developing countries. As you can see here in the chart, is just I'm sure you know that figures, but this is the distribution of the so it shows us that industrial structure matters. 24% of the emissions worldwide comes from agriculture, forest, and land use. Why I brought that? Because in the developed world and in multilateral organization, the discussion on climate change.
Okay.
Sorry? It's okay?
João Paulo, não. Juliana is going to telephone you.
Telefone, tá.
Yes. João Paulo, faz o seguinte, conecta pelo telefone no Zoom, desliga, deixa a sua conexão ligada pelo computador, mas põe no mudo e você vai falar no telefone, entendeu?
Tá, entendi.
Então, pelo telefone, você vai falar como se estivesse falando ao telefone, mas só sem imagem, só com a voz.
Beleza.
Vai ser como se fosse um...
Beleza. Agora, uma dúvida. Mas eu mexo na apresentação pelo computador, né? Eu acho que está sendo interferência do telefone. Quer tentar seguir assim, falando pelo telefone, dessa forma? Com os dois ouvindo? Vamos ficar assim, não tem problema, não. What you missed exactly? Okay. Okay, great. That's New York City. There's a lot of equipment around here. Okay, great. As I was saying, like the discussion on climate transition and developing the developed world is defending on a green and zero or a global. This.
Apologize, we will try.
Yes, okay, I'm sorry, everyone. We are trying to reorganize. I mean, I have a question, Daniela, just to get us started. And if anyone else has questions, you can either raise your hand or just jump in or write in the chat. But my question would be, well, I have actually two questions. You say we're on an unavoidable path, but aren't there other actors who could get a comparative advantage by not taking into account environmental or social considerations? And I have no direct knowledge of this, but a lot of people say that the Chinese, for example, are going to be lenders of preferentially so if I want to build a coal-fired power plant and BNDES won't lend to me, there will be this other source available. So is it really an unavoidable path, or is it something that requires more? And I guess the other side of my question would be, then what is the role of civil society to push in this direction? Because are we just going to allow the banks because of their own goodwill and they're interested in this, or is this something that's a result of public pressure and that it's important for civil society to have a role advancing this agenda?
Are you hearing me?
Yes.
Okay. Okay. I'll begin with the last question. I think the role of the civil society is very important. I think that each stakeholder together may, the only path, the unavoidable path is that we are facing global warming. This is unavoidable. And to mitigate the risks and to adapt to our societies, including reducing the risks of losses, not only financial losses, but human losses. All the stakeholders must be together. So the civil society putting pressure on the regulators, and the politicians, the policymakers, and the decision makers on big industries and banks, they are absolutely important. And so I think the combination of civil society and regulation and policymakers and also companies, financial system can bring a more reachable, how can I say that, a more, not sustainable, but a less suffering path for facing climate change. All this, I think only this combination is possible for us as a society to approach a kind of solution for the crisis that we are facing. The climate emergence is an emergency, it's a crisis now. And I definitely think that all together must reach a better path for that. Otherwise, we are being lacking something. For example, if the financial system doesn't go together, we are spending money with non-sustainable projects, and all the governments will lose with that. They will lose taxes. They will lose with the emergencies in hospital. They will lose with the disasters to attend people that are being impacted with climate change. So there are a whole combination of these stakeholders together make a better and strong, robust system. And regarding the Chinese people that are willing to take advantage of something that the others are not willing to finance anymore. I definitely think that's, of course, it's a difficult question. But, you know, I think there is a kind of systemic, it's a global problem. So India is, they cannot breathe anymore. So in China, they have faced this for a while. And so I think they are, the only path is to save money for the government and save lives, will be trying to mitigate and adapt to the society. And as a global concern, it doesn't matter if they finance things, coal power plants in other countries or in other economies, because CO2 doesn't have a proper space, and everyone will be suffering equally. Or not, because I think that the poor people will suffer more. It's not equal, the impact. And even in societies where have more inequalities, they will suffer even more. And unfortunately, it's the case of China. It's just the case of China. But of course, they can have gain, profits, but without this vision, this view for long-term view, we'll fail as a society in tackle climate change.
Okay. Okay, thank you for that.
I think João Paulo is already.
Is João Paulo, can we go back to João Paulo then?
Yeah, I believe it's working now. Yeah, so that the specific case of the US is to implement a job guarantee program through green investments, basically energy and green services. But it's not a new idea, and it's not restricted to the U.S. In 2009, the United Nations Environment Program released a report that discussed exactly the case of having a global Green New Deal to tackle, to address the challenge of the global climate, the global financial crisis at that moment. And as we see, the countries worldwide, they are implementing an effort to actually make this global Green New Deal a reality. This chart shows the change in carbon content of electricity in different countries. As we see here, the UK, Denmark, and USA and China has been doing a great effort in cleaning their energy matrix. This is from a World Economic Forum report, which is pretty interesting. It was just released. And also, as you know, like there are several international agreements towards towards the climate transition, the limitation targets on temperature, and also a commitment between the advanced countries to finance developing countries to implement green investments. The point that I want to address first is at what extent this discussion on green energy transition and this global Green New Deal is actually addressing the developing countries' challenge. First, I bring in that slide a little bit of a discussion on this supply funding for this green transition, and we have domestic and international capital, public capital like taxes, the ODAs, loans and grants from select development banks. We have national development banks effort, and also the private capital on that, like with green bonds, private equity funds, and etc. And the climate finance flows actually increased during the past few years. In 2013, we had $342 billion available in the market. In 2017, we had $530 billion available in funding. It means that this whole multilateral effort on fostering these initiatives against climate change is working. The agents are able to leverage resource in the market. However, if we look at the distribution of these resources, it is still very uneven. 45% of these resources are from private finance, 46% from public finance, which is supposed to be good. However, only 33% of these resources go to middle-income countries, and 3% only for low-developed countries. What does it mean? It means that probably these private investments, private capital is going to investments that already have positive financial returns. And they are not definitely going to countries with higher risky or to activities that have higher social returns but lower private returns. And that's one challenge. Because if we look at the history of the energy sector and of the renewable energy introduction, the state actually played a relevant role in the risk investments at the very beginning of the implementation of this technology, as we show in that paper that was just released as a working paper at the ASA institution in Vienna. We see here the costs of electricity in the past 10 years. The blue and red lines here in the top are solar energy. And you can see that in the beginning, solar energy was much more expensive than energy that you obtain by coal or by fossil fuels. But during time, these costs actually decreased while the technology was introduced and developed. And now we see that in the US, the coal mills, they are at risk. Several of them have been closed or have been shut down, or at risk of being closed in the next few years. It has much to do with technology investment and with the state's role on increasing private returns. But it's still like we see that the governments in advanced countries, they still give subsidies for this kind of activities. This chart shows the subsidies for the US in 2019. And we see that in average, the US government still subsidizes 9% of the operational costs for renewable energy. And given that, why we are discussing bringing the private capital without discussing the role of state? It doesn't make much sense, especially for developing countries and for the Amazon. If we see here, this is a chart that shows the performance of green bonds and carbon taxes in the past years, and you see that the governments have increased carbon tax is the blue one, and green bonds issuance is the orange one. you see that during the past few years, the share of carbon taxes over the global emissions sharply increased from 4% to 16% worldwide. It means that the governments are trying to get revenues to do this type of activities to give subsidies for renewable energy or other activities. And also the private market accompanied that, and the green bonds issues sharply increased here. Actually, the green markets increased from, in 2010, we had $16 million in green bonds issuance. In 2018, we had $143 billion in issuance. It is still a small share of the bonds market, but it has been increasing. And as we know, the asset holders have been increasingly considering ESG practice in their portfolio decisions. In Europe, 50% of the asset owners apply this type of criteria. So green bonds matter, and the state also matters with carbon taxes. Here I show a little bit of an overview on the green bonds market, just to show again that although it's increasing, it's also restricted to high-income countries. 60% of the green bonds issuance were in high-income countries, and only 24% in upper middle income. But among the upper middle income countries, we have China with 15% of the issuance. So although it's growing, it's still restricted to investment grade and lower risk markets. However, what's interesting and what we can observe in our data is that governments and multilateral organizations worldwide are using green bonds issuance to de-risk green investments for riskier agents. We see here that this distribution shows the distribution of the current yield of green bonds along time. And we have here in the left private bonds, and in the right government and multilateral bonds. Bonds with long maturity and short maturity. We know that usually those infrastructure investments, they are long maturity investments. So let's look at the long maturity investment in the top first. And we see that in average, the private bonds are paying higher yields than the government and multilateral bonds. Around 5% versus around 2% for government and multilateral. We run regressions and we show that it means that the multilateral and government organizations and governments have room to de-risk investments in low-income, middle-income countries, or higher risk investments. And we should use this state power. However, it's still, those investments are restricted to the private and energy. And we demand a huge amount of money that the current supply is not already addressing. Here it's a table with a literature review on several estimations on the investment needs for climate transition. The first group is for mitigation, energy, transport, etc. The second group is the amount of resources that are supposed to be needed for forests, and the last group for adaptation. The adaptation estimations, they are not very reliable, so I will not talk about that. But what I want to address is that for infrastructure, for clean infrastructure, they are estimating an amount of resources needed in around $9 trillion per year. While for forestry, the estimations go from $6 billion per year to $2 trillion per year. Why I'm showing this table? Because if we look at the global Green New Deal or the Green New Deal in the US, we see a huge program on infrastructure. And it demands $9 trillion per year. And the international organizations or these program leaders, they don't seem too concerned with forestry and with other challenges in developing countries that probably do demand a lower amount of resources than infrastructure, like forestry. Here we have a diagram and all the tools that are available to finance climate transition from multilateral organizations and governments. I can send it to you later. It's from a very interesting report wrote by Watson and Charlotek, 2019, from a Germany NGO. And we see several agents and several instruments, and not several of them are channeled to forestry, Amazon, etc. Also, recently, UNCTAD report was released, and they discussed that the Green New Deal is not working properly, and they should rebuild the Green New Deal for developing countries. They don't mention in the report the challenge of doing the challenge to do with structure change in developing countries. And they don't even mention the challenge of leverage resources to the Amazon, which is that they are concerned that they are saying that the existing public resources are de-risking green investments, and they have been using to private purpose. And they mentioned that this private approach constrains the gains that we could have if we would bring a public purpose. But they don't. It seems that they are not actually concerned with this structure challenge from the developing world. And why I'm saying that? Because it sounds like the Green New Deal is not a global solution. Look at the case of Brazil, and it's probably the case of other countries from the Amazon. Brazil is now the seventh largest emitter in the world, and 57% of this emission is generated by production activities, iron mining, forestry, like 50% for forest actually. Brazil has passed through industrial structural change in the past few years in favor of resource-based goods exports. In the first bullet, you see a paper that I quote here that shows that from 2000 to 2016, the share of resource-based goods increased from 10%, around 10% to around 20% in the exports. The same pattern we see in other developing countries, not only in Brazil, in Asia too. There is a paper, Zong et al. In 2018, and they show that. Our data from research that we are conducting show that the emissions in Brazil are most explained by this change in the industrial structure towards resource-based goods. It's econometrically shown. But the Green New Deal doesn't discuss that. To be fair, here in the US, we have debates on possibility of having a degrowth strategy instead of following a Green New Deal. They argue that the Green New Deal focus at full employment increased consumption and follows the same consumption pattern, which is not able to be reconciled with sustainable development. But if we follow a degrowth pattern and the developing world, what we will have is that the poverty will probably increase, the jobs that should be created will not be created. So it's still like the developing world debate is not clear, at least here in the US. So how to reconcile growth and the Amazon preservation? This is my last slide, actually, just for discussion. And first, I'm convinced that we should think of a Green New Deal for developing world, probably a forest-based Green New Deal. And some discussions or tools that have been discussed in the academia or for policymakers are relevant to help us to bring a solution for the Green New Deal. First, as we said, asset owners and managers have increasingly included ESG practice into their portfolio decision variables. We have $30 trillion worldwide that are willing to be channeled to ESG investments. However, asset owners still need methodologies to incorporate climate change risks, and the asset owners still need to understand the Amazon and developing world reality, so they can then invest or invest in green activities. Third, we see that at least in Europe, the European Central Bank is pushing the possibility of doing a green quantitative easing. The quantitative easing was a policy measure from the US and European governments to combat the global financial crisis in 2010. They bought a lot of assets in the markets, and there is research that showed that these assets that were purchased were mostly carbon-intensive assets. So now the European Central Bank is saying that they are willing to sell these carbon-intensive markets and replace it for green assets. It's a possibility, and for Brazil, it's especially important. We can say that the Brazilian Development Bank played the same role of the European Central Bank in doing a type of quantitative easing during the global financial crisis. And also, we should discuss a new green industrial policy for developing countries, try to change the export pattern and the industrial structure. Ricardo Bramovai in Brazil now just released a book which is called Amazon Towards a Nature-Based Knowledge Economy. I'm really excited to read that. And I know that he proposed a new approach to the free trade zone that we have in Manaus. It sounds interesting. We should discuss that. Generate value and innovation, forest-based innovation. And also, and last, a carbon taxation might be discussed. I don't see, at least in Brazil, a discussion on carbon taxation. And the Amazon conservation demands stable funds from the public budget. So these are the 5 topics that I bring last to discuss. I hope you heard me properly and that these topics help the discussion. Also, what I brought today in these slides is part of an ongoing research project on the Green New Deal. So comments are welcome. This is my mail.
Okay. Thank you very much, João Paulo. We appreciate that. We did hear you well. do have a few minutes for discussion. Our, as Sinumar has pointed out, there's room in the chat for anyone to ask questions. Are there any, I mean, there were a lot of provocative ideas there. But I don't know if there are any questions here or online.
Should we move the chat more on the screen to see if there's questions?
There are none yet.
There's no question.
Okay.
Ask them.
I have one question.
Yeah, we have a question here from Betty. Go ahead,
This
Betty.
is João Paulo. At one point, I can't remember what slide it was, you talked about some new sort of market mechanisms. And you had what there, to me, seems like an oxymoron, which was a regulatory incentive. Can you explain what a regulatory incentive is and how that might work?
Sorry, where exactly in the presentation?
That was about 2 slides back, I think.
If you just flip your slides back, maybe we can find it.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, this one, under the making banks work better for development.
Okay, great. Great, thank you. Yeah, I didn't explain properly this slide. These are the main recommendations from the UNCTAD report. And what they say, we should save the multilateralism system, and the Green New Deal is an opportunity to save that. And what they say, first, the debt has increased in the developing world, but the debt is not working for the real development goals. So public debt must increase. Second, private capital doesn't work for development at all. Governments should make capital controls. And third, banks should work better for development. And what they say, first, central banks should use their power to foster climate finance. And it's interesting that we see that the European Central Bank just this week told the market that they were going to act selling carbon securities and buying green securities. But on top of that, they mentioned that central banks should apply regulatory incentives to increase the ability of private banks to fund green investments. And it might be like decrease capital requirements or allow them to take more risky in projects, change the Basel rule. They mentioned different possibilities. It's a very interesting report. You all should read that. And they also mentioned sovereign debts and funds and development banks as a way of as institutions that can work together with the central bank in that financial market revolution.
Okay. Yeah, it seems like Daniela mentioned the central bank resolution 4327. That seems to be exactly this line of using their regulatory power to influence the private banks and other public banks.
And also the TCFD that you mentioned that aggregates the G20 central banks. Is that, Daniela, maybe a path in this direction?
Yeah, it's right. It's right, Julian. Yeah, yeah. I think they will. This is the new guideline. They are studying deeply involved with this in concern with systemic risks, and soon I think some of the central banks will establish some strict regulation on that.
But you mentioned, Daniela, talking about this, you mentioned that they they had some piloting initiatives on this topic, but they were not happy about the first report. They were not satisfactory in terms of. I'm not sure, so I just wanted you to explain more what they were not happy about in terms of transparency, in terms of indicators, in terms of the assessment criteria. What happened in this piloting experiences?
Yeah, all of this together, they found many things. They found not regular standardization of the taxonomy. They found that the bank and the company and the pilot had problems to disclose properly. Right?
Já está pensando muito. Não ouviu a lance.
Ah, ok.
Vai, ó. Põe o seu no mudo.
They found many kind of problems, and they reported this like, oh, we are happy to results, the outcomes of this research, this piloting, but we have big challenges ahead. We have to tackle taxonomy, we have to tackle metrics, we have to tackle the willingness of the boards to undertaking these measures, to release information, because all of this will be linked later on with capital markets. You can imagine the impact on the capital markets regulations as well. So we're not talking about central banks, but about SEC, about CVM in Brazil, about many IOSCO, that's the regulator of all of this capital markets regulator, the aggregation of them. So all this have a systemic role. So they are concerned, but they are engaging hardly in trying to leverage the awareness and the tools, the proper tools, to find out the better results in the next time.
Okay.
Claudia.
There's one more question here from Claudia.
No one has questions anymore?
No, there's no more questions online right now.
Hi, thanks so much. I'm Claudia. I have a question for João Paulo. I'm curious about your slide on the degrowth, contrasting the economics of Germany and others with Japan. And I have a little bit of reservations in considering Japan a model of economic growth or development, because at the end, a lot of what Japan does is consume what other places produce. So it had a huge footprint in terms of timber consumption from Southeast Asia until it started to draft some form of procurement policy, but a lot of the timber that was not suitable for export markets in Europe was going actually to Japan without any standards, not to say about fisheries or other activities. So I want to see what is your take on that, and thanks in advance.
No, thank you so much. Japan is one of the most interesting cases, just not to say the opposite, actually. It's terrifying, like the Japan's performance in the climate topic. Are you still seeing the slides? No.
Yes.
Yeah, seeing this chart, like how you have all the advanced countries improved their carbon content of electricity, their carbon footprint, and Japan is keeping decreasing that, like increasing that. And what I'm arguing here, and it's not actually me, it's Robert Pauling in a defense of the global Green New Deal versus the growth strategy. He's saying that, look, those who advocate the growth strategies are saying that zero growth or degrowth is enough to solve the sustainable development challenge. What he's saying is that look at Japan. Japan has been passing through very low growth rates, zero growth rates, or negative, and it still relies on fossil fuels a lot. And while Germany, UK, Spain, they've been growing, and they were able to decouple growth from fossil fuels consumption. So it's a kind of defense of having a Green New Deal instead of the growth strategy for environmental purposes.
Great. Okay. Well, thank you all for participating. Thank you, João Paulo and Daniela. I just want to point out that here in the chat is a link to the giaamazon.org website. And specifically on that website, we have created a discussion forum related to this webinar. So anyone would like to provide any more comments or ask questions, and we can follow up and continue this discussion online. Also on the Amazon site, we'll eventually, and if you all are agreeable, we would like to share a recording of this webinar there. We would also like to share your slides and a summary that we are writing up of the presentation. So we're creating a space where those who are not here at this particular moment can also access this very valuable information. So thank you very much for participating. I don't know if you realize there are about 10 or 15 people online and about 15 or 20 people here in this room. So we very much appreciate your perspective, and we hope to be able to continue this discussion with you going forward, okay? And good luck with your research, and thank you very much. Okay.
Okay, thank you all.
No, sorry for the technical difficulties
no,
there.
I'm sorry for that.
We'll work, well, we always have them when we're doing this video conferencing. That's worked well though in the end. So thank you very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you for the initiative.